All right, well, hello everybody, and thank you so much for joining us for PlantRight's 2014 Invasive Plants Webinar. My name is Greg Richardson. I'm a project manager on the PlantRight project, and we have a couple of really terrific presentations lined up for you tonight that will be presented by Chris Crawford, a project associate for PlantRight, and Christiana Conser, our project scientist. There are a few things that I'd like to note as well. This webinar is being recorded, so if you are so enamored by our presentations that you want to share this with all of your friends, you can do so. If you want to come back and review some of the material, it will be made available and send you the recording. In addition, this webinar, if you are a Master Gardener, is eligible for continuing education credits. And then lastly, if you're joining us and interested in participating in our Spring Nursery Survey, in order to do that, you will be asked to answer a 5-question quiz on our website based on the content of this webinar. And it's not supposed to be difficult, but I just want to alert that to you as I think it will be easier if you are paying attention. So the way we have divided up the webinar tonight is into 4 main sections. The first one will be on invasive plant background. This is what are invasive plants, why does this matter? The next will be a 20-minute segment on our nursery survey and instructions around that. And then we will conclude with a 20-minute segment on the ecological context, biodiversity, and habitat restoration as it relates to invasive plants. And as I mentioned, please feel free to ask questions through the chat box on the bottom right side of the page throughout this entire webinar, and we will get back to you about them at the end. So with that, I would like to introduce our first speaker, who is Chris Crawford. He is PlantRight's project associate and is leading our annual Spring Nursery Survey, which is a collaborative effort, as many of you may know already, to track the retail market for horticultural and invasive plants across California while lending general support to PlantRight's other efforts. Chris is originally from Michigan and has worked with environmental issues in a variety of places. Some of his favorite experiences have come while surveying rural agricultural and conservation in Zambia, researching invasive species, large-scale restoration projects and environmental policy in New Zealand, and conducting a recently published study of the singing behavior and characteristics of pine warblers in northern Michigan. And Chris received his Bachelor of Science at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, where he studied ecology and evolutionary biology and physics. So with that, I'm going to pass the presenter privileges over to Chris, and he will take it from here.
Great. Well, thank you for the great introduction, Greg. It's great to be here tonight, and I'm really excited to be joined by all of you. It's going to be really exciting to share more about PlantRight, our project, a brief introduction on the biology of invasive plants and their impacts, and also share with you a really great opportunity for you to help. So before we go any further, let's establish a common understanding of what exactly we mean by an invasive plant. So by definition, invasive plants are foreign or not native to an area. But keep in mind, not all foreign plants are invasive. Invasive plants spread on their own, meaning that they don't need irrigation, soil amendments, or tillage in order to thrive. And they also cause measurable harm, whether it's financial, environmental, or to human health. But you're probably wondering, how exactly do invasive plants cause harm? What do we actually mean when we say this? To put a better image in your minds, I'm going to walk through a few examples on how these plants cause harm from both an ecological perspective and an economic perspective, because as everyone knows, the economics really do matter. And this is something that we're really looking forward to. From an ecological perspective, invasive plants have the tendency to move in and entirely take over in an area. And by crowding out existing plants and wildlife that relies on those native plants, these invasives often reduce biodiversity. And this is something that Christiana is going to be talking about more in depth later on tonight. This picture you see on the screen here, this shows a coastal dune that's been completely covered by Carpobrotus edulis, highway ice plant. And as you can see, it's made it awfully difficult for anything else to grow here, and it's fundamentally changed the ecosystem. But this doesn't just affect the native plants. For example, the coastal dunes form the most important nesting habitat for the small bird in the lower left-hand corner of the screen, the western snowy plover. And as a result of habitat losses like this one, the western snowy plover is now endangered. And invasive plants also have a tendency to alter soil compositions. On the left, you'll see Scotch broom. And Scotch broom is actually a nitrogen fixer. It actually deposits nitrogen into the soil. And this can make it easier for other invasives to move in and harder for native plants to reestablish. In the middle is salt cedar, Tamarix ramosissima. And they actually pull salt up from deep groundwater, pull it onto their leaves, and that gets deposited onto the soil, which makes it difficult for other plants to grow. On the right, you'll see eucalyptus, blue gum eucalyptus, Eucalyptus globulus, which also has toxins in the leaves that get into the soil as the leaves decompose and inhibit the growth of plants in the understory. Invasive plants can also affect hydrology, or the water cycle in a region. Rather than a meadow, this picture is actually of a stream in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta that's totally been taken over by water hyacinth. This doesn't only reduce the flow of water, as you can imagine, it also makes it really difficult for anything else to grow in that water. All of that growth on the top cuts down on oxygen and sunlight levels in the water below, and it also makes it really difficult for terrestrial wildlife and birds to access that water. But what about the economic impacts? California spends $82 million a year monitoring, mapping, and controlling invasive plants. But this doesn't take into account some of the harder to calculate costs. For example, several invasive species in California are highly flammable and contribute to fuel loads. This causes fires to burn bigger, hotter, and more out of control. And these fires are expensive to control, and they can cause serious harm to property and infrastructure, which, as you know, have their own costs. And when invasive plants grow in cropland, they're considered weeds. And as one of the top agricultural states in the country, a lot of money is spent controlling weeds. These weeds can result in lost agricultural yields, lowered land values, and a lot of frustration, as you can see. Now here's a table that summarizes all these impacts. And as you saw, they're varied and they're very significant. And while this isn't an exhaustive list, it's part of why we think it's so important to do something to address this issue. But before we can, let's take a step back and think about, well, where do these invasive plants come from in the first place? A study that researchers at the University of California Cooperative Extension conducted in 2003 found that almost half of all invasive plants in California were introduced through the horticultural industry. And this isn't about pointing fingers, but it's good to realize that a lot of these plants, like pampas grass, were introduced over 100 years ago before their invasive tendencies were known. And while the majority of these aren't sold anymore, some of them continue to be grown and sold for horticultural uses today. And so we realized that we really needed to work with the horticultural industry, nurseries, gardeners, etc., going forward and educate all sides of the supply chain. And this, in essence, is the motivation for why the PlantRight program was started. As you'll see, PlantRight's mission on the screen here is to phase out horticultural invasive plants and in their place promote non-invasive plants in a fashion that is voluntary, in which we encourage people and our partners to be leaders to take ownership of this issue and ownership of the solutions. Collaborative, in which everyone has a voice. We've been bringing together various stakeholders, as many people as we can who are impacted by invasive plants. And science-based, meaning that we use objective data and research to guide our work. The project was started in 2005, and since then we've drawn together a steering committee of a diverse alliance of leaders from the nursery trade, from plant growers and retailers to landscapers, from nonprofits and environmental groups, from government agencies, and from the plant science and academic community. And this steering committee has been very influential on our progress, and they've helped make sure that we've created a practical program with realistic and actionable solutions, as you can see here. And along the way, we've also developed a very important regional plant list, which helps identify which plants are the biggest concerns and where they're problematic. But because PlantRight is all about coaching the do's instead of the don'ts, we've also identified more than 50 beautiful alternative plants that work well in place of these invasives. And to complement this, we've been conducting outreach and education along the way. Currently, there are 4 main tiers of our program, as you see here on the screen, things that we're currently working on. And as our outreach and education efforts have evolved, we've started a continuing education program at the end of 2013. This is geared towards individuals with a range of existing knowledge, from avid gardeners to professional landscapers to landscape architects to individuals like yourselves who would like to bolster their existing knowledge and stay up to date on issues surrounding invasive plants in California. And after completing a short PlantRight 101 training on our website, these folks will gain access to a variety of resources to help them make an impact and help be part of the solution. This is also available for continuing education credit for participating groups. And in the fall of last year, we started a retail nursery partnership program, through which we've really been able to engage nurseries and garden centers in the state. This is something we're really excited about, and it's been taking off this year. This is a way for us to help stores be part of the solution and advance their understanding and expertise about invasive plants. So if you're interested and you want to learn more about this, you can find information on our website, or you can reach out to us, and we'd be happy to let you know more. One of the other main projects is called the Plant Risk Evaluation, which is something that Christiana has been really engaged with over the past few years. This is focused on preventing the next big invader, what we call emerging invasives, to identify those before they get into the horticultural industry and out into natural areas. It's really exciting to be able to take a preventative approach on something like this, rather than continuing to take Band-Aid approaches and fix the problems that we have. And last but not least is the nursery survey, which I'm assuming many of you here today are interested in. And I'm going to go a little bit more in depth into this right now. So in this first part of the presentation, I've gone over the impacts of invasive plants, the how and why invasive plants pose a risk to natural environments. Now, Christiana is going to talk a little bit more about this and how it relates to biodiversity later on. But it's important to realize with the survey, this just takes it a step back, and it helps us identify the presence and source of existing invasive plants in the trade so that we can address them before they become a bigger problem in natural environments. So far, our survey has had a very significant and beneficial impact on our project overall. For example, by giving us a concrete sense of what plants continue to be sold through the trade, the survey gives us the information we need to update our list of invasive plants each year and stay up to date. The survey not only informs how we modify our list in terms of removing plants that are no longer sold or relevant to the industry, but it also gives us a way to research plants as we're thinking about adding them to our list. For example, this year we're including 4 new plants on our survey to evaluate their presence before we consider adding them. They are grassland sedge, Carex divulsa, oxeye daisy, Leucanthemum vulgare, Brazilian waterweed, Egeria densa, and southern catalpa, which is Catalpa bignonioides. Don't worry, you don't need to remember those now. We'll get more in depth into that later, and you'll be able to find all that information on our website. And after years of research and hard work from volunteers like you, we were really excited to put all that information to good use and issue our first update to our invasive plant list and list of suggested alternatives. This came out earlier this year in January, and we think it's a big improvement, and it's really exciting for us. Now, before we talk about how exactly all of you can participate in this year's survey, let's go over a little bit of background. So I'll highlight the survey mainly exists primarily as a data collection effort. It helps us track the retail market for invasive plants in California. It helps us understand what plants are being sold where and by whom. And it also helps us strategically engage the nursery industry to phase these plants out of the trade in a way that's good for businesses and good for the environment. But we don't use the survey as an outreach or an advocacy opportunity, and I'll talk more about that in a bit. a bit about the survey design. So due to the seasonal nature of gardening and horticulture, as I'm sure all of you know as avid gardeners, spring comes at different times in different places. So we split our survey into two regions, Southern California and Northern California. For our purposes, Northern California, which I'm assuming many of you are joining us from, will include all of the counties north of San Luis Obispo, Kern, and San Bernardino counties. Our Southern California survey, including those counties and below, began at the beginning of March and is going to run through May. And in Northern California, our survey begins next Monday, April 21st, and runs through June 22nd. Now, you might be thinking, there's thousands of retail nurseries in California. How do we choose which ones to survey? Well, this year we've chosen 263 retail nurseries, and we've done this in a random way for statistical purposes. And this selection process was done in a way that was proportionate to the number of nurseries that exist in a county. So a county with more people and more nurseries is going to have more nurseries selected. Now, for those of you who are interested in participating going forward, and I hope that's many of you, I'm going to go over some of the steps, all of the steps for participation, and they're easy ones. So to start, this will include creating an account on our website, PlantRight.org, completing a short 5-question quiz online, which Greg mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, selecting a store to survey in your region, gathering the appropriate survey materials, visiting that store and collecting data and taking photos, and then submitting that data and photos that you took online, and then giving us feedback on your experience. Now, this part is optional, but we certainly encourage it. We enjoy hearing your input, and I must say over the past year it's been great to have that feedback as we improve our survey. And it's important to note in the increasingly technical age that we live in, all of these steps, except of course actually visiting the stores you signed up for, all these steps can be completed on our website. So let's go through those. Here you see a screenshot of our website, www.plantright.org. Now after you go to our homepage, the first thing you want to do is log in. You'll see on the bottom left there is a space for email and a space for password. And if you have an account, but you simply can't remember your username or password, as I often find that happens to me, you can click the Request New Password link and have that access info sent to your email address. Or, if you don't have an account already, and you want to create a new one with a different email address, you can do that by clicking the Create New Account link in the bottom left, as you see where the arrow is pointing to. And that's going to take you to the following screen, which shows 3 options, 3 types of accounts you can create. Since you'll all be Spring Survey volunteers, you'll want to click the button that this arrow points to in the bottom middle that says Create Survey Account, and then fill in the information as requested, as I'm sure all of you are familiar with. And after logging in, you'll be taken, you'll see now here, there's going to be a Spring Survey tab on the left-hand side of the screen, right directly underneath Resources. And the first thing you'll want to do is go to the Webinar Quiz tab and take our short 5-question quiz. These questions, like Greg said, it's not designed to be difficult. It's designed to be straightforward and easy, but it's meant to ensure that you viewed the webinar or the refresher video. Now, to complete the quiz, to pass, you have to answer at least 4 out of the 5 questions correctly. But don't worry, you'll be able to take the quiz more than once. And if it's helpful, you can go back and view the webinar recording at any time. Now, after you take and pass this quiz, you'll be taken to the 2014 Spring Nursery Survey Instructions page. This page should serve, as your home base, and you can access this through the instructions link in the sidebar as shown by the arrow here on the screen. This walks you through each stage of the process, and it includes links to all the relevant materials. You can also find these materials in the Survey Materials tab, which is something new we've added this year after receiving feedback from volunteers. And this just has the exact same materials, just in a more straightforward way to download. And as you'll see, step number one right here on the instructions page is to sign up. Select a nursery to survey. So let's go to the nursery list and review what nurseries are available. You can access the nursery list as shown by this second arrow down here. It says select a store. And I'd like to note these nurseries are going to become available online on our website at noon on April 21st. If you go on today, you'll probably only be able to see stores in Southern California, Los Angeles, Orange County, etc. But if you go back at or after noon on April 21st, you'll be able to access over 150 stores to choose from. Now, the reason we do this is to just provide a little extra time for those who are unable to join us tonight so that they have the opportunity to view the recording and sign up for stores just like the rest of you. So after this list becomes available on our website, it'll look something like this. And once you find a store you'd like to survey, you can click on the text on the right-hand side of the screen where it says, survey this nursery. And what's circled up at the top of the screen, there's a box that says county, and you can actually sort the stores by what county you're interested in. So, say you live in Sacramento County, you can click that drop-down menu and choose Sacramento County. So once you find a nursery you like, you can click Survey this nursery, as shown here in this circle. And this will take you to a new page that asks if you're sure you'd like to survey this nursery. And you'll click Yes, and a few things will happen next. One, you'll receive a confirmation email from our system containing information on the store, and you'll also notice that the store will drop off the list of available nurseries. Now, if you'd like to see information on the nurseries you've signed up for, you forget which ones you signed up for, you can do that by clicking on the My Nurseries link, which I just circled here on the left, in the sidebar on the left side of the screen, where all the nurseries you've claimed will now show up. If for some reason you're unable to conduct your survey and you'd like to unclaim the store, you can do so through this My Nurseries page by clicking the individual store and then clicking the Unclaim This Nursery link at the bottom of the page. Now, what happens if you go to the website and there's actually no stores left? This has happened before. In some cases, all the stores in your area may have already been selected. If this is the case, we recommend you get in touch with us because it's always helpful. It's always going to help us to have more data, and we're really happy to work with you to find a nursery or two or three in your area that works for you. In some cases, there could be stores in neighboring counties that might also work for you. Maybe you live close to a border, you're going on a trip soon, and you know you'll be in a certain area. And this can be a really great way to help out in a county that has fewer volunteers than the county you're in. If this is something you're interested in, all we ask is that you wait maybe about 2 weeks after the stores become available, just to give volunteers in that county the opportunity to sign up if they're interested. So after you select your store, the next step will be to gather your survey materials. What you see here on the screen, I'll go into more detail on these, but what you see here are the survey instructions, the survey form, a plant ID guide, and an explanation sheet. Like I said earlier, these materials will be found on our website on the instruction page and also in the Survey Materials tab on the left side of the screen. We recommend that you print these and take them with you to your store, and specifically with the Plant ID guide, we recommend you print it in color to help you identify certain plants. If you're unable to print these, get in touch with us. We'd be happy to print them and send them to you. Here you'll see the 2014 instructions checklist. This is very similar to the instructions page that we went over on the website, but it's in a form that you can print off and take with you to the store in case you don't have an internet connection there or you have some questions while you're there. This here is the survey form, which includes each of the plants on our survey, complete with the scientific name so you don't have to remember all those big words. And it has a space for each item of information we like to collect. This list is organized by growth form, as I've highlighted in orange on the left, put a square around all the grasses. And it includes space for basic information, like the date, your name, and contact info at the top of the form. In particular, I'd like to highlight the store code space. We identify the store by a code rather than by name in order to protect the store's identity and conduct our survey in best faith with the industry. And there's also space for additional information on how long it took you to conduct the survey and what the store's response was, if it had one, which can be really helpful for us. I'd also like to highlight this space on the right for cultivar name and or plants in the same genus, which has given some volunteers confusion in the past, including myself. So a plant might have a cultivar name when it is a variety of an existing plant species, and these cultivar names are commonly in single quotations. So for example, Cordidaria celoana ivory feathers, with ivory feathers being the cultivar name. We ask that you record this information here, along with the names of any plants that you might find that are in the same genus as plants on our list, such as different types of brooms, like sweet broom, for example, or different types of pennisedums, fountain grasses. Now here on the back side, this is the back side of the survey form. You'll see at the bottom there's a space for notes, which has been really helpful in the past. So once you're at the store, the first thing you're probably going to notice is all the signage, it can be all topsy-turvy. Each of these stores is going to have totally different signage. And it might not always have all the information that we're asking for on our survey form. Like, for example, it might not have the scientific name on the label or the name of the grower, etc. With this in mind, since we've had this issue in the past, we simply ask that you do the best you can and record all the information that's available to you. It'll be helpful for us no matter what. And next here, we have the Plant ID Guide, which shows pictures of each of the 15 plants that we're surveying for this year. Again, organized by growth type, as I showed you on the survey form. So grasses at the top, shrubs, trees right underneath them. And this can be really helpful when you're identifying the plants in the store. These plants can look pretty different in the stores than they do out in the wild, especially depending on the time of year. So in order to help you identify these plants in the nursery, we've included these little inset photos to show hopefully what the plant will look like in the store. On the left here we have green fountain grass, Pennisedum cetaceum, and on the right is periwinkle, Mica major. Oops. Excuse me there. This is the last material on our list, and it's what we've called our explanation sheet. This has a bit of background information about PlantRight, about the survey, and it has some of the most frequently asked questions that you can use to answer questions you encounter during your visit. But this again leads us to the question of how exactly should you interact with store staff? We do our best to conduct this survey in good faith with the nursery industry. And the survey is not tied to any regulatory efforts, and because all of the information is kept confidential, there's no risk to individual stores. So we do welcome you to inform the stores that you were there to conduct the survey, and there's no disguises necessary. If you find yourself talking to a store employee, this would be a great opportunity for you to use the explanation sheet that we just talked about. It has a lot of good talking points, and you can leave it there with the store staff if you'd like. And you can even refer them to our website if they have a question you're unsure of how to answer and they'd like to learn more about our program. And if you'd prefer not to engage with the store staff and just collect your data and go on your way, that's okay too. Information gathering like this happens in the industry all the time, and our survey is not unique. So if you're asked, in the off chance, if you're asked not to complete the survey, we ask that you please respect the store's request and leave courteously. And just let us know so we can address this on a case-by-case basis. But rest assured, this has only happened a handful of times in the past few years. So even though it's unlikely, we'd like you to be prepared. And I'd like you to remind you all that the purpose of the survey is data collection. It's not outreach. So we kindly ask you to refrain from doing any advocacy or outreach during your nursery visit. That being said, if you are interested in playing more of an ambassador role and gaining additional tools for effectively engaging your favorite stores in your area, gardeners, landscapers, etc., about this issue, we invite you to learn more about our continuing education program, which I talked about a little bit earlier. Get in touch with us or visit our website if you're interested. Okay, so now you're at the store. Now what? We recommend you give yourself about 45 to 90 minutes to complete your survey, depending on the layout of the store size, and how well things are labeled. First, we just recommend you get the lay of the land. For example, if there are annual sections for indoor plants, edibles, or even natives, remember that these plants aren't really going to show up on our list, so you can feel free to skip these sections entirely. Now, what to do if you find an invasive? First thing you want to do is record all the available information on the survey form, like I showed you earlier. And next, you want to take a photo of the plant. And we ask that you take at least 2 photos, and more is definitely welcome. The first photo is a close-up of the plant label, and then one of the plant itself. These photos are really important for us because they allow us to verify the identity of the plant, because in some cases these plants can be mislabeled. For example, there's a new plant on our survey this year, Carex divulsa, which is often sold mistakenly under the name of Carex tumulicola, which is actually a native grass called Berkeley sedge. So these photos that you take will help us differentiate between these 2 species. And some of the things we've noticed in the past with these photos is that sometimes they can be distant, blurry, lacking in reference, and it can make it difficult for us to verify these plants. And because these photos are so critical, we really want to emphasize that you take clear photos, and if you have a digital camera, I recommend that you just check the photos before you leave the store, just in case you need to take another one. Thanks so much. And remember, there's really no harm in taking extras. If you like the layout of a store, if the plants are blooming spectacularly, or there's some quirky installments, as you can see here, feel free to take them and send them our way, and we'll be very grateful. So after you've completed the survey and collected all the data, it's time to hop back online onto our website. After you've logged in again, you can see the Submit a Survey and Upload Photos tabs on the left-hand side. And to submit your data, all you have to do is click that tab and then fill in the submission page that has fields that are identical to those on the survey form. Once you're all finished, you hit Submit, and you should get a confirmation email from us saying that you've successfully submitted your data. After you've submitted your data, you can upload your photos from your camera to your computer and submit those online by clicking the Upload Photos tab. And after you select the nursery that you'd like to submit the photos for, as shown here on the screen with Test Nursery 1, we'd like you to put in the description field what plant it is and whether it is the plant or the tag. And that just helps us keep things straight and organized. Now, in that confirmation email, you're going to receive a link to an optional questionnaire. And like I said, it's voluntary, but we really appreciate any and all comments that you have. This has helped us improve the survey in the past, and it should only take about 5 minutes to complete. And just like that, you finished. And if you've had a great time on the survey, like I hope you do, and you'd like to conduct another survey, or maybe 2, you can head back to that nursery list and select another store. And of course, if you're a master gardener, I remind you that the survey does count towards your volunteer service hours. So make sure to log your hours online through the Master Gardener Volunteer Management System. Now that concludes my part of the presentation, and I want to thank you all for coming and for listening. And I look forward to working with all of you this year. Thanks very much. Next up, we have a very exciting presentation.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Chris. That was really wonderful. I want to remind everyone that if you have any questions about the information that Chris just presented, feel free to type them into the chat box. And I noticed that a number of the messages that were being sent before were being sent to me privately. So make sure to choose under the Send To tab, just select everyone, and then we can all see the questions and feed off of each other's good ideas. So now I'd like to take a moment to introduce Christiana Conser, who is the project scientist for PlantRight and is completing a PhD in plant sciences at UC Davis. Through her studies, she is developing a plant risk evaluation system, as Chris mentioned, for the nursery for the nursery industry to screen plants for their invasive characteristics prior to their being imported. Christiana is actually also the current secretary of the California Invasive Species Advisory Committee that goes by CISAC, which is part of the California Department of Food and Agriculture, CDFA. Her previous work included designing large-scale riparian habitat restoration and invasive species removal projects for river partners in Northern California and for the Instituto de Ecología in Mexico. She received an MA in Ecology and Systematics from SF State University, and her thesis research, which looked at restoring coastal habitats invaded by ice plant, was published in Biological Invasions in 2009. So, without further ado, I'm going to pass over the speaking privileges to Christiana. There may be a little bit of a gap, and I'll let her take it from here.
Thank you, Greg, for a very nice introduction. Let me see if I can work the controls here. All right, good evening, everybody. As Greg mentioned, I'm a plant ecologist, and I've spent the last 15 years studying invasive plants and how to restore habitats. And I originally became interested in this because I traveled around with my parents a lot when I was young, and just noticed that there were plants that came from other parts of the world that seemed to kind of take over. No matter where you really go, this phenomenon is happening. And in California, we've come to associate plants like ice plant so much with, California's sort of natural beauty that, ice plant has showed up on a state stamp a few years ago. So people don't even realize that some of these things aren't part of the, the natural landscape of California. So I became really interested in sort of looking at why plants become invasive, but then also why certain ecosystems become invaded. And we're going to talk about that a little bit today, and really just look at invasive plants in more of an ecological context. And that'll kind of help inform how this impacts biodiversity, which is something that applies not only to California, but elsewhere as well. And then I'll conclude by talking briefly about how we can apply this knowledge to restore invaded habitats. So there's three reasons, I think, why invasive plants are important. The first is that right now there's a lot of controversy about funding for invasive plant programs all over the U.S., actually. And invasive plants are actually pretty distinct from agricultural weeds in the fact that they can establish without irrigation or cultivation of any kind. Agricultural weeds have a direct economic impact on agriculture, so it's a problem that our Department of Agriculture in the different states and the U.S. Department of Agriculture does spend a lot of money on. Invasive plants that establish in wildlands is kind of a newer, more emerging issue, and there's a growing awareness of this issue, and more wildland invasive plants are now being listed on federal and state noxious weed lists. So it's kind of a growing issue around the country. There's also been pushback, kind of similar to climate change. There's been a lot of pushback in the last 5 to 10 years, kind of questioning the validity or are invasive plants or invasive species really a problem? Are they really negative to biodiversity? And so I think as a community, we have to learn how to answer this criticism. And so part of my talk today is sort of understanding on a deeper level how the complexities of ecosystem function can kind of give us insight into how invasions occur and why it's a threat to biodiversity, kind of putting that in a larger context. And it's also important because there's a lot of policies right now being shaped on this issue. The USDA and CDFA here in California are stepping up their regulations on invasive plants and pests that are both imported to the country or the state or just transported around the state. And there's increasing attention on preventing and managing invasions. So understanding how they occur and why certain plants are invasive in certain contexts becomes really crucial to shaping policy on this issue. So my talk tonight has 4 sections that I'll briefly just go over. I'm going to talk first about the dynamic nature of ecosystems. And then talk a little bit about how disturbance is actually a natural part of ecosystems. And then how this kind of leads into why invasions occur and how they happen. And then lastly, I'm going to just touch briefly on habitat restoration and, can you fix an ecosystem once it's been disturbed and invaded, which is something that I've always been interested in. So first I'm going to talk about just how dynamic ecosystems are. Originally, when ecologists were studying sort of how ecosystems succeeded over time, it was a pretty simplistic viewpoint of that. They kind of looked at, first you'll have sort of annual plants moving into a barren area, followed by grasses and then more shrubby plants until you get to what they call a climax community, or a large, mature, deciduous or hardwood forest. But they also kind of recognized that a really important piece of the puzzle was missing, and that is disturbance. So disturbances are really what knock ecosystems back to that barren landscape, or, ground zero, as it were. So if we don't include sort of the different types of disturbances in ecosystems as part of the picture, we're really not seeing the whole picture here. And there's different types of disturbances that can occur and affect ecosystems. We have natural disturbances such as fire and flooding, or storms, large storm events like hurricanes and tornadoes, or things like disease. We also have anthropogenic disturbances such as human development, resource extraction, or flood control systems. And these disturbances can occur on both large and small scales and over time. And so historically, this actually resulted in sort of a patchwork mosaic of patches of different habitat size across the landscape. And it provided a lot of complexity and diversity to the system, which now we don't have as much of. And so to kind of show you how disturbance works in an ecosystem, I'm going to show you sort of a 10,000-foot level of that. First, we would have sort of, if you look on the bottom right-hand corner, what we would call a release event. And this is the disturbance itself. So whether it's a fire or a flood or a storm comes in and levels a forest, it basically wipes out all the existing mature vegetation that's above ground. And then the ecosystem will go through sort of a reorganization phase. Some of the trees that are resistant to fire may resprout, but you'll also have a lot of seeds that are coming in from outside that landscape to sort of recolonize the bare habitat. And then it goes through a long growth phase where you'll have sort of that succession that I showed you a couple slides ago, where you'll have first sort of annual species coming in, and then grassland, and then eventually shrubs and trees to mature forest. And then it goes back into what we call a conservation phase, which is that large mature forest that really doesn't have a lot of change over time. It'd be what we call an old growth forest or something like that. So how does disturbance affect ecosystems? And I think, this also provides opportunities for both ecosystem changes, but biological invasions as well, just depending on the health of the ecosystem. So if you think about ecosystem health, this is actually a graph kind of representing that. On the x-axis is time. So as we go throughout time, ecosystems kind of fluctuate around an equilibrium state, where they're basically essentially healthy ecosystems. They may have small disturbances, but they stay about the same. Over time, disturbance can affect ecosystems in different ways. So the ecosystem can experience a disturbance and remain fairly resistant, going right back to that equilibrium state, relatively unchanged. And this would be something like riparian vegetation along a stream, and a flood comes by, and the willows and plants that grow along stream banks really are flexible, and they can withstand that change, and they just bounce right back. We also have resilient ecosystems that, they experience a disturbance like fire and basically just are resilient to that change. So chaparral communities throughout California are used to experiencing fairly regular fire, and a lot of the plants can just resprout after fires as long as the fire isn't too hot. But sometimes you can have disturbance events that are so severe or on such a large scale that the ecosystem doesn't really have the components available to bounce back. So it basically changes. It turns into a different ecosystem that, as you can see if you look at the state of the ecosystem, is less healthy. And it's because you've lost a lot of the complexity that was there before. So complexity and diversity are the key factors that really promote resilience and resistance. That is, ecosystems with a variety of habitats and species can withstand changes a lot better. Ecosystems that become degraded and have less diversity are much more vulnerable to regime change than functional ecosystems. So you can see on the right here, these are a list of things that actually create those vulnerabilities in ecosystems. This graphic actually represents the level of ecosystem health in an intact versus degraded ecosystem. Fully functional intact ecosystems, as they become more degraded, they obviously will require more human management. But there are certain sort of thresholds that they can go past where they've degraded so much where it negatively affects the plants and animals there. And basically, you need to go in and restore the habitat to have it going back to a healthy state. So continuing degradation in these habitats would continue until the physical things that are needed for life aren't there anymore. So you could continue to degrade it until it didn't have clean water or soil, and then you would actually have to replace those things as part of the habitat restoration. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about how this kind of creates the opportunity for plant invasions to occur. So first, plants establish and spread via transporting in via various pathways. So they can disperse in via wind or water, animals, or intentionally or accidentally by humans. And we have many accidental or intentional pathways from their native range to their introduced range. But once they get into an ecosystem, they have to be able to colonize. So they have to be able to withstand whatever environmental conditions are present in that ecosystem. And about only 10% or less of any introduced species will be able to actually get to the step of colonization. So it's sort of like a series of steps. Can you get there? And then can you actually withstand the environmental conditions? And if you can you get to the point where you can establish, which means that you can reproduce and establish a population. And only about 10% of species are actually able to do this. So as you can see, of the number that get there, only a small fraction actually are able to colonize and establish. And then the last step is spread. So as invasive plants are able to spread from their source populations and establish across the landscape, they crowd out native plants and replace food resources for animals. And only about 10% of established species are able to spread. And for each of these steps, there's actually different strategies that you can use or employ to reduce invasive plants at those stages. So we can obviously, help to identify how native invasive plants are getting here and reduce those factors. By minimizing disturbance in the landscape, we can help prevent which species can colonize there. And by promoting early successional natives as part of our landscape and our restoration, we can prevent establishment of invasive plants. And then finally, we can really isolate source populations of invaders when they've just first invaded and sort of prioritize those before they spread. So it gives us sort of a way that we can strategize managing these things at different parts of the invasion. And then the last thing I'm just going to touch briefly on is sort of why I became interested in habitat restoration and invasive plants is once you get to that point where the ecosystem is so degraded, how do you actually restore it? And there's a lot of considerations that go into it. First is sort of where should the restoration occur? So looking across the landscape, this is the Central Valley and the Sacramento River. We would look across that landscape and decide what are the high priority places? Where's the greatest need? Where's the greatest probability that the project would be successful? So can we actually restore it? What size and shape would be the best for that ecosystem for restoration? And how do you connect that landscape to other ecosystem patches along the landscape, which is really important for resilience. And then since the goal of ecosystem restoration is really to restore functionality of an ecosystem, it kind of goes beyond just planting native plants. We want to create a resilient ecosystem that can sustain itself. So some of the considerations for projects are looking at which species can establish and persist based on the conditions there. What requirements do the target species we want to attract have? So what do we build to make them come? And how should the site be managed in the long term for invasive species? Because there's always going to be this pressure, always going to be things kind of trying to come in. And how will the species that we put into the landscape influence the site themselves? And then finally, we just need to understand the role of disturbance at the site. Is there fire or flooding that we need to manage? And how do we promote resilience in that ecosystem? So that's sort of the end of my talk. The sort of intention here is what I want people to see is that invasions are both part of the plants that invade, but they're also part of the landscape that's being invaded. And so these things can happen opportunistically, sort of based on disturbance regimes being altered and things like that. And so it's really a complicated question of understanding that entire picture so that you can decide what to do as a manager. So thank you very much, and if anyone has any questions, please let me know. And I'll pass it back to Greg.
Okay. Thanks so much, Christiana. That was really wonderful. I do have a couple of questions here, and I welcome those of you on the call to continue to type in questions. I'm going to ask the first one actually of Chris, and that question is, how can we be an ambassador for PlantRight if we aren't supposed to do outreach during the survey? Can you please explain that?
Yeah, thanks, Greg. That's a really good question and something I admittedly didn't really go very far in detail into in my presentation. As far as being an ambassador, we're asking that if you decide you'd like to become an ambassador and you'd like to do outreach, we welcome that, but we want you to have tools, to have resources to be able to do this really effectively. And if, for example, you're a master gardener, as many of you are, we ask that you do that ambassador outreach under wearing a different hat, so not wearing your master gardener hat and doing that separately from the master gardener system. And the reason is just to prevent any confusion and make sure that you're not speaking on behalf of the Master Gardener program as a whole, but as a concerned individual. And yeah, I hope that helps answer that question. And I think that the resources that we have can be very valuable for conducting that outreach. So I recommend you get in touch if you are interested. And I know I've had a tough time talking with stores myself in the past, but it's great to have talking points available and a way to really know how to do it effectively. Wonderful.
Thank you. And if I'm understanding that correctly, also part of it is you can kind of think about the two as almost being separate.
Yeah.
There's the nursery survey and the ambassador program.
Right. Yep.
Okay.
They complement each other very well.
Perfect. And for Christiana, are there examples of conservation efforts that in thinking about these thresholds and the equilibrium states of ecosystems, having that in mind, that you can point to that, you know, have been done right, and maybe some conservation efforts that perhaps were done, I don't want to say wrong, but maybe were done in a way that those aims were not achieved?
Sure. I guess probably the first example that would come to mind would be River Partners' work actually in the northern Sacramento Valley. It's been interesting. They do a lot of riparian restoration, which is along stream sides, like on the Sacramento River. And if you know a lot about the Sacramento River, you'll know that it's highly managed for flood control and also for water for farming. And so that's actually a big restoration challenge in that area because you have sort of the altered hydrology throughout the year. There isn't flooding the way there was historically. And so it's hard to get native plants to persist in that kind of environment. And so there have been projects that they've worked on that have done setback levees, such as right next to Marysville, Yuba City. And it's actually going to prevent the next big flood event from flooding those two big cities, or, you know, big cities to the Central Valley right next door that were under 10 feet of water in 1997. So that would be a good example, I think, of a restoration project that was sort of looking at what the natural disturbances are and sort of how to incorporate that into a restoration design. But I guess an example of maybe where that didn't work so well, you often hear a lot about sort of mining, restoration after sort of mining companies have gotten done with a piece of land, and often there's challenges with that because you've had so much soil removed from an area that, you know, to go back to a functioning ecosystem, you would actually have to import, you know, tons and tons and tons of soil to replace that. And I guess that happens in a lot of areas where there's soil erosion from just windstorms and stuff like that. Like in Mongolia, it's a big problem where their soil just flows off and is gone. And so it has to essentially be replaced before restoration can establish plants again. So there are certainly challenges that, you know, restoration is still trying to figure out how to address. So it's not necessarily a cut and dried case of just planting plants and letting it go. So I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, that was terrific to hear some real-world examples. I want to recognize that it is just about 8:30, so if anyone needs to go, please feel free to. I'm going to ask, we have just two more questions here. And the first one is of Chris, or for Chris. Is it okay to complete the nursery survey with more than one person?
Definitely. I'm glad you asked because I meant to mention that earlier, but it's definitely okay for you to conduct the survey with a friend or two. In the past, some master gardeners have gone in larger groups, and they've actually, I've heard that they enjoy it more that way. You can kind of split up and cover certain parts of the nursery. If it's a particularly large nursery, you could each take a section, and it's an efficient way to get the work done, and enjoy your visit to the nursery. So.
Good. Okay. Thank you. And then we have one more, and that is, what happens if we don't find any invasive plants at the nursery?
That's another great question. If you don't find any invasive plants, as we hope you will, it's going to make your job even easier. All you need to do, you'll still need to go onto our website and submit that data because even finding no plants still constitutes data. So you want to go to our website, go to the Submit a Survey page, and instead of, you'll still need to input all of the general information about the store code, the date, your name, etc. And you can just leave all of the fields blank for each individual species. And for each species, it'll ask, did you find? It'll ask if you found that plant at the nursery, and it's automatically checked as no. And you can just leave them all as that, and you should be good to go. So.
Great. Okay. Well, so that's the end of our program tonight. Thank you all again very much for joining us. It's really a pleasure to be able to share our work and this information with you all, and I hope that we continue to work with you through the spring. So I'm going to end the meeting, and if you have any questions of us, you can contact Chris or Christiana, or even myself. My information is up here at any time. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great night.